I was treated like a burden inside the very house I paid for. Every morning, someone knocked on my door just to make sure I was still breathing. Every month, I had to transfer money for rent and utilities just to sleep in the corner of the ground floor living room. And then one day, they calmly told me I should find somewhere else more suitable, because nothing in life is free. And the shock that left the entire neighborhood silent was not the sight of me dragging my suitcase out the door, but the moment the truth was exposed in broad daylight. I had been paying faithfully to live in my own property, while those who called themselves the homeowners had, all along, been collecting money from their own biological father as if he were a stranger. If you have ever been turned by your family into an expense that needed optimizing, ever been diminished by words that sounded perfectly reasonable in front of outsiders, leave a dot. So I know where you are listening from, and follow so you do not miss the stories, where the truth is spoken at the right moment, and dignity is fully reclaimed. Thank you for being here with me. I wake up every day in what used to be the living room of this house. The old sofa was pushed against the wall, long ago, replaced by a low single bed, the foldable kind, just enough to make people believe I'm only staying temporarily. The ceiling is a bit low, morning light slipping through the gap in a thin curtain and falling onto tile flooring, worn at the edges. I am used to opening my eyes before 6 in the morning, not because I am particularly healthy, but because I know that if I lie still for too long, someone will knock. The knock is not loud, 3 short, even taps, the kind of knock from someone who does not want to disturb, but still needs to make sure there is a person inside. "Dad, are you up yet?" Lena asks, her voice just loud enough to pass through the thin door. I answer immediately, always do. Not because I am eager to greet the morning, but because I know that if I am even a little slow, she will open the door, stick her head in, and scan the room with the look of someone inspecting an old item to see whether it is still usable. "I'm up," I say. The door opens slightly. Lena stands at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, her eyes flicking over me, the bed, the small table pressed against the power outlet. She nods as if she has just completed a familiar procedure. "Remember, it's colder today. Don't turn on the heater without asking," she says, then closes the door. I lie still for a few more seconds, listening to her footsteps fade away, blending into the familiar sounds of the house waking up. The coffee machine humming, chairs scraping, Evan coughing softly at the end of the hallway. The house begins to function, and I have already finished the first task of my day, proving that I still exist. I get out of bed, slip on my sandals, and pull the blanket straight where it has already been neatly folded. Everything in the room stays in fixed positions, because I have learned that the fewer changes I make, the fewer reminders I receive. I step out and wash my face in the shared bathroom at the end of the hall, careful not to use hot water for too long. Evan is extremely sharp with numbers. He does not need to look at the meter to know which day the bill goes up and which day it goes down. Breakfast unfolds in a carefully controlled silence. Lena and Evan sit at the dining table while I stand by the kitchen counter, pouring myself a glass of water. I do not make coffee. Evan once said the machine consumes a lot of electricity, and I do not want to hear that sentence again. "The gas bill seems to have crept up this month," Evan says, eyes still on his phone. His voice is flat, neither harsh nor accusatory, just a managerial observation. "It got cold earlier than usual this year," Lena replies, then turns to me. "Dad, try to keep warm with layers." I nod. I'm used to every piece of advice carrying an unspoken message. Do not generate additional costs. After breakfast, I return to my room. I open my phone and check my bank account. Right date, right time. $2,400 for the room was transferred last night, along with $380 for this month's utilities. I always send the money early because I understand that even a one-day delay is enough to become a long conversation. Lena talked to me about money after she and her husband moved in. At first, it was just to keep the house from feeling empty, to look after one another, to save on outside rent. I agreed, thinking simply that a house is warmer with children and grandchildren. A few months later, Lena suggested keeping things clearly separated because living expenses had increased, electricity, water, and community fees had gone up. She said she would collect a fixed amount each month for easier management, explaining that the house was under a legal entity's management. The owner lived far away and did not want to be disturbed. It sounded so reasonable that I nodded without asking for documents, because at that time I still believed I was living with my child, not yet realizing that I had already been shifted into the role of someone who had to pay to stay. In the early months, I was still invited to eat at the same table. Later, I arranged my own dinners. No one forbade me. Things simply drifted into the positions they found appropriate. I ate earlier, cleaned up more carefully, and avoided using the kitchen when Lena was cooking for her small family. I learned how to exist without being in the way. At midday, Evan usually works from home. He walks between his office and the kitchen, headphones on, mouth full of terms I do not fully understand. I do not disturb him. I read in my room or go out to the backyard, sitting on a faded plastic chair. The small yard is enough to plant a few flower bushes, but I have planted nothing. I do not want to leave traces of having ever wanted to stay long term. One afternoon, while I am reading the newspaper, laughter carries over from the living room. Evan brings a friend home. I am not informed beforehand, but there is no need. I hear Evan's voice, animated, completely different from when he speaks to me. "My place is a bit crowded," Evan says to the other man. "My father-in-law lives with us. We take care of him." That sentence reaches me clearly, even though I am in my room. I do not know how to react. I do not step out to greet them. I also do not close the door. I sit still, my hand resting on the newspaper, my eyes fixed on a line of text I can no longer read. Take care of. A phrase that sounds very nice. It makes the speaker look responsible and compassionate. I wonder if, had I been standing there in the living room, that sentence would have changed. Probably not, because in their view, I truly am someone being taken care of. I have a place to sleep, food to eat, and someone to remind me when to turn the heater on or the lights off. What more could I possibly ask for? In the evening, after everyone has gone to their rooms, I make another transfer, this time for additional utility costs that Lena says were incurred today, because the washing machine ran more than usual. I do not ask why. I simply confirm the transaction went through and put my phone down. I lie on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I think about Margaret, my wife. If she were still alive, she would probably say something very direct. She always saw the core of things faster than I did. But Margaret is gone, and I am still here, in the room that used to be the living room, waiting for the knock every morning to prove that I have not disappeared. Tomorrow, everything will repeat. 3 taps, a question, a nod. I have grown used to that rhythm, at least for now. I have kept the habit of waking up early since the years when I was still working. Every morning, as the upper part of the house begins to fill with the sound of the refrigerator opening and hurried footsteps, I lie still, staring at the low ceiling, letting memories drift back to very distant days. Some secrets do not need to be summoned. All it takes is a moment of silence, and they find their own way back. 20 years ago, I won the lottery. I told no one, not friends, not my children. At first, I even hesitated to tell my wife. That day, I sat at the kitchen table, the ticket neatly folded in my jacket pocket. Margaret stood at the sink with her back to me, her hair already threaded with gray from sleepless nights, worrying about the kids. I called her name twice before she turned around. I did not say the numbers. I simply placed the ticket on the table. She looked at me for a long time. She did not cheer. She did not press me with questions. She pulled out a chair, sat down, read every line carefully, then looked up and asked, "What do you plan to do?" I Said I wanted to pay off old debts, save for old age, and help the children when needed. Margaret shook her head. She was used to seeing things differently from me. Helping now, she said slowly, means opening the door for the next time. They will come back, not for you, but for the money. I objected. I said they were our children. Margaret did not argue. She only reminded me of the evenings our daughter would call, starting with a few polite questions and ending with an urgent amount she needed to borrow, of the times she came over and, before the chair had even warmed, asked whether we could help cover a deposit. We raise our children, she said, but we cannot live their choices for them. We were silent for a while. Then Margaret said the sentence I have never forgotten. Secrets do not rot quickly. They rot deep. But sometimes keeping them is better than exposing them. The decision was made that very night. Before that, we had owned a small house. We bought it when the children were young and lived there for nearly 30 years. When Margaret became seriously ill, that house was sold, partly to cover medical bills, the rest to close a chapter that had grown too heavy. The new house was purchased afterward, registered under a legal entity, through an independent lawyer in another district. Everything was neat and clear, but no one in the family knew. To the children, I only said I had found a stable place to rent. The owner lived far away and did not want to be bothered. They believed it, not because I was persuasive, but because the story fit what they wanted to believe, that their father was old now, with nothing left worth worrying about. From then on, I did everything slowly and discreetly. I opened a separate mailbox and used an external mail service outside the community. Property tax, insurance, maintenance fees, all paid by me on time, through accounts completely separate from family life. I learned to handle these seemingly complex matters with the same hands that once worked with technical drawings and high-voltage cabinets. Caution was not born of fear, but of knowing exactly what would happen if I slipped. The years that followed passed quickly. Margaret grew weaker. She no longer had the strength to walk around the neighborhood as before. Some days she sat by the window, looking out at the garden, asking whether our daughter would come by. I said maybe on the weekend. The weekend passed with only the sound of neighbors' cars. She did not complain. She only sighed, more tired. When Margaret was hospitalized, I stayed there more than at home. The children came, but not for long. Each time they asked the doctor first, the cost second, and only then asked about their mother. I saw it all. So did Margaret. Once, when it was just the two of us in the room, she held my hand and whispered that she could not bear having to guess, every time they came, how much they would need that day, and that she did not want the final days of her life measured in numbers. The day Margaret died, it rained. I handled all the arrangements in silence. The children were busy and asked me to take care of everything. I did. After the funeral, they returned to their lives. I returned to the house bought in secrecy, continuing the rest of my life as a tenant in my own property. For 20 years, I maintained that discipline. No display, no traces. I paid taxes early. I kept receipts neatly. I made repairs when needed, calling contractors from a private number. I did everything as an invisible owner. And with my children, I kept the role of an old man living on a pension, someone who needed to rely on others. 3 months after Margaret's funeral, the house became too large for one person. I lived as usual, but Lena could see the emptiness I never spoke of. She was the one who suggested it first. She said I should not be alone at this time, that being close to children and grandchildren would be better for my spirit, that Sophie needed her grandfather, and that if they moved in, the family would have one another and spend less than if each side rented separately. At that time, Lena and Evan were renting, and the cost was not low. Living together was presented as a solution beneficial to both sides. Family closer, finances lighter, care easier. I agreed because I thought it was natural after my wife's death, not to save money, but because I did not want the house to contain only my footsteps. In the first months, everything went exactly as promised. No one mentioned rent. It was just splitting utilities and daily expenses. Whoever used more contributed more. I transferred money regularly to keep things clear, not wanting my children to have to carry me. Gradually, the wording changed. Contributing became a fixed amount. For clarity became at market rate. And from that point on, the roles in the house shifted. Evan began managing expenses. Lena collected the money. I was still there, but no longer in the position of the one who opened the door and invited the children home. At first, we lived together out of affection. Then we lived together out of convenience. And finally, we lived together. But the right to decide no longer belonged to the person who owned the house. By the time I moved down to the ground floor, when the old living room was remodeled into a sleeping space for an elderly person, that secret was tested in a different way. Every morning, the steady knock sounded at the door, not to say good morning, just to make sure I was still in there. Evan controlled everything with a reasonable tone. Temperature, lights, water, all explained with clear numbers. Lena said she was authorized to collect money for the homeowner who lived far away. The paperwork was in order, her words smooth. I transferred the money on the exact date. $2,400 for the room, $380 for utilities. The numbers increased, along with what they called the market. I nodded. I had grown used to it. I hid ownership to keep the peace, but the price was living in the role of someone without the right to argue back. That afternoon, there was a guest. I stood in the hallway and heard Evan say warmly, "My father-in-law is staying with us. He's old, so we let him stay downstairs for convenience." No one asked for my opinion. No one looked in my direction. I was not introduced as a father, much less as the homeowner. I was referred to as an accessory. Temporary, easy to arrange, as long as I knew my place. That night, I sat alone, remembering Margaret's words. Secrets do not rot quickly. They rot deep. 20 years of shielding had helped me preserve the most important thing, the right to decide. But those same 20 years had also cost me a long silence, and I knew that every secret has an expiration date. When people begin to believe they have a right to your life, that is when a secret is no longer a defense. It becomes tinder. On a weekday afternoon, Evan came out of his home office into the kitchen just as I finished washing a few chipped bowls at the back sink. I heard a car stop in front of the house, parked neatly, nose facing the street as always. That kind of parking was not how someone parked when they were home, but how someone parked when they were just stopping by, ready to leave once business was done. Evan entered through the front door, sleeves rolled up, phone pressed to his ear. I stood waiting by the kitchen doorway. He glanced at me, gave a perfunctory nod, then continued the call for nearly another minute before hanging up, as if I were simply a detail already accounted for in this space. "You doing okay, Dad?" The familiar question spoken quickly, not waiting for an answer, just enough to clear the way for what came next. We sat down at the dining table. Evan pulled his chair in close, placed both elbows on the tabletop, the posture of someone accustomed to making decisions here. Without preamble, he said it plainly. "I need you to support me with some money." I did not ask how much. I knew the number was always held back, waiting for the right moment to carry weight. Evan began laying out a new warehouse, machinery import contracts, and projected profits if he could turn the capital before the end of the quarter. His voice was smooth, confident, the kind of man who had practiced telling this story many times, in front of a mirror, to partners, to himself. Then he lowered his voice, slowed it down as if caution itself could soften the listener. 180,000. The number landed in the middle of the table, neat and cold. I looked at the man living in this house, the man who every month spoke to me about electricity, water, and household costs in a managerial tone. I asked a very short question. "Have you calculated all the risks? Evan nodded almost immediately. Too fast. He said there were contingencies, cash flow, and a repayment schedule. Everything sounded more like a presentation to a bank than a conversation with a father-in-law. He kept talking, still steady, still rational, as if that sum were merely an item awaiting approval, not the sweat of a lifetime sitting across from him. Lena appeared at the living room doorway at some point. She crossed her arms, leaned against the frame, and listened to the entire exchange. When Evan finished, she walked over and sat beside her husband, naturally, as if this were a family meeting with roles already assigned. "Dad is always hesitant," she said, "but this is a real opportunity. Families should lift each other." I said I could not help with that amount. Not now, not that way. The air in the room shifted immediately. Evan frowned. Lena's breathing grew heavier, her lips pressed tight. "You always say that," Lena snapped. "Retirement money, savings. You're not short on anything. Or are you keeping it all for yourself?" Evan neither defended nor opposed her. He stayed silent, letting Lena handle the difficult part for him, his eyes fixed on the tabletop as if memorizing a new figure. I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully. I did not want to pour more money into decisions I did not control. I did not want to spend the rest of my life as an open safe. Lena laughed, a short, dry laugh, the kind from someone tired of hearing refusals. "You make it sound noble," she said, "but you should remember one thing. You're living under my roof." Lena and Evan still claimed they carried the household expenses, but because I was the one whose name this house was under, I understood perfectly well. The money keeping this house alive all these years came from only one source: me. Lena's words were not loud, just soft enough to turn me into a fixed position in the house, not one to be heard, but one to be managed. "You live here, eat here, use electricity and water here," she continued slowly. "You're not the ones setting conditions anymore." Evan remained silent. He let that sentence rest on the table. His silence was a nod without sound. Evan had been sitting near the window the entire time. He did not interrupt, only held a small notebook, scribbled a few lines, then crossed them out. I did not need to look to know what was written there. Expenses, cash flow, the shortfall if that $180,000 did not materialize. To Evan, I was not a father-in-law. I was a line item on a balance sheet. "We're not forcing you," Lena said, her voice turning falsely gentle. "You just need to understand where you stand." I looked at my daughter, the child who once fell asleep on my shoulder. Now she was teaching me my position. I told Evan I would not provide that money. Advice, if he wanted it, I was willing. Money, I could not. Evan stood up. The chair scraped lightly against the floor. "I understand," he said, though his voice carried no understanding at all. Lena stood as well. She looked at me once more, her eyes no longer accusatory, only carrying the indifference of someone who had finished drawing a boundary. Evan closed the notebook and stood last. Before leaving, he turned back and said very politely, "Think it over some more. These things affect the whole family." The whole family, not including me. The door closed. The house fell quiet again. I looked at the chair Evan had been sitting on, pulled it closer to the table, and straightened it neatly. A small motion, but a necessary one to steady my breathing. That night, I ate alone. No one asked if I needed anything. No one mentioned the afternoon conversation. Everything was set aside, as if I, too, were just an object that had completed its function for the day. In that moment, I understood very clearly. In my children's eyes, I was not someone to be remembered, but an option. When that option was refused, they grew irritated. Then they moved on. I turned off the living room light and walked slowly back to my ground floor room. And for the first time, I thought, with complete clarity, if they only remember me when they need money, then perhaps it is time I remember who I am, and who this house truly belongs to. It began with something that seemed very small. That morning, the water in the bathroom was only lukewarm. I stood under the shower longer than usual, waiting for the temperature to rise, but there was only the dull hum of the machine behind the wall. When I stepped out, I knew the boiler had a problem. I had seen this kind of malfunction many times in my life. Not immediately dangerous, but if left unattended, the repair costs would climb. I sent Lena a short message saying the hot water was weak and that we should probably call a technician soon. She replied almost an hour later with just one line. "We'll talk tonight." By afternoon, Evan came home with a stack of papers. He placed them on the dining table, right where I usually sat. No small talk, no questions. "Home insurance sent a warning," he said. "They received a risk report from the latest routine inspection. The boiler is deteriorating, and if it isn't replaced, premiums could increase, or coverage related to water leaks could be excluded." Lena sat down across from me, both hands neatly placed on the table. She reread the notice, her voice even, each word clear, as if explaining it to a stranger. "The boiler is old. Replacing it is the most reasonable option. Total cost is about $4,000. I nodded. That number was within expectation. I asked when we would call a technician. Lena did not answer right away. She turned to Evan. He opened his phone, scrolled quickly, then said, "While we're at it, we also need to clarify the living expenses." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. No one raised their voice. There was no outward tension. Everything unfolded in an orderly manner. "Living costs have gone up," Lena continued. "Electricity, water, HOA, repairs. You're downstairs and use several things separately. We can't carry it all anymore." I looked at her. I had heard these lines many times before. Only the amount changed. "So," Lena went on, "starting next month, your share will increase by $600 per month." She said the number lightly, like quoting the price of a familiar item. No pause for reaction, no question about ability. I repeated it to make sure I heard correctly. "600? Yes," Lena replied. "This model is reasonable. Compared to the market, it's still low." Evan nodded. He added a few more figures, explained the cost allocation, and showed a simple chart on his phone. The way he spoke made it sound like a decision already finalized. I sat still. No objection, no argument. I was used to changes being announced, after agreement had already been reached. Lena looked at me, waiting for an answer. When I did not speak, she leaned forward, her voice lower but firm. "You have two options." That sentence settled everything. 1, you accept the new rate and transfer on time like before. 2, you find somewhere else more suitable. There was no word like kick out, no harsh language, but the meaning was clear. I asked one last question, very slowly. "If I don't agree?" Lena did not avoid it. "Then we can't continue like this." Evan said nothing more. He simply straightened the stack of papers, like someone who had completed his task. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was still tidy. The lights were just right. There were no signs of an argument, but I understood this was not a negotiation. This was a final notice. I said I needed time to think. Lena stood up first. "Take your time. But we need an answer soon." There was no date written on the papers, but her eyes told me there was not much time. That night, I sat alone in the ground floor room. The sounds of life upstairs continued as usual. Television, dishes, everything went on normally, as if the afternoon conversation had never happened. I replayed the numbers in my head. Room payment, utilities, the increase. Not because I couldn't manage it, but because every acceptance was another signature confirming the position they had assigned me. I remembered what Lena said that afternoon. "You're living under my roof." Today, that sentence has been rewritten in numbers. The broken boiler was just an excuse. HOA was just a tool. What they wanted was a clearer boundary, one where I no longer had the right to hesitate. I didn't sleep right away. I sat for a long time, staring at the opposite wall. 20 years of keeping a secret, to preserve the right to decide. And now, in that very house, I was being asked to pay more to be allowed to stay. The next morning I woke early. I gathered a few small items, old documents, a notebook. I didn't tell anyone. When Lena came down to the kitchen, I had already prepared breakfast for myself. She looked at me, slightly surprised that I didn't bring up yesterday's issue. I said only one sentence. I understand. She nodded as if everything were settled, but I knew that from that moment on something had begun to move. Not loudly, not urgently. I had simply stopped being silent in the way they were used to, and that ultimatum, though they didn't know it, was exactly what triggered the rest of this story. I did not say another word after that ultimatum, not because I had nothing left to say, but because everything had already been said in the way they looked at me. When someone is placed in front of a choice like that, the most reasonable reaction is not to argue, but to withdraw. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I no longer had a reason to lie there. I folded my clothes slowly, one piece at a time, choosing only what I truly needed. Not much. A few sets to wear, personal documents, the old notebook where I tracked expenses. Everything else I left untouched. Not forgotten, but because I did not want to make noise. I had already prepared a lease in advance. The apartment was a few blocks away on the second floor of an old building, rent $1,450 a month. The size was just enough, with a window overlooking a parking lot and a small grocery store. The landlord was an elderly woman, direct in speech, efficient in work. I signed the lease in 15 minutes. No one asked why I was moving. No one needed to know. I pulled my suitcase to the door while the upper floors of the house were still quiet. Sophie stood on the stairs, one hand on the railing. I did not know when she had woken up. She looked at me, eyes red, lips pressed tight. "You're really leaving?" I nodded. No explanation, no long instructions. I knew any words now would only make things harder for her. Sophie stepped down a few stairs, then stopped. She hugged me quickly, tightly, as if afraid that letting go would cause everything to break. "Call me, okay?" she said, her voice catching. "I will," I answered. One word, enough to reassure her that I was still there, in my own way. Lena appeared afterward. She stood in the kitchen doorway, coat loosely draped, hair hastily tied back. Her eyes passed over the suitcase, paused briefly, then moved on. "Where are you going?" she asked, her tone even, as if it were merely a routine check. "To live elsewhere," I said. I avoided any words that might suggest something temporary or open to negotiation, because I understood very clearly then I was not leaving to be kept, and I did not need permission. Lena shrugged. "Think it through. Everything will settle down." Evan did not come out to see me off. I heard him upstairs, pulling out a chair, turning on the television. Life continued as usual, as if my leaving were only a minor adjustment in the schedule. I closed the door very gently, not to be polite, but because I did not want to leave any more traces in that house. The new apartment smelled of old paint and dust. I opened the window, set the suitcase in a corner, and sat on the only chair in the living room. The space was empty, but breathable. Here, no one checked on me every morning. No one tracked my electricity use. No one reminded me of my place. That afternoon, Sophie texted to ask if I was okay. I replied briefly, "Okay." I said nothing more. She needed reassurance, not the weight of adult emotions. Lena did not call, neither did Evan. In the evening, I cooked a simple meal. I ate alone, but did not feel as empty as I had imagined. I realized this silence was different from the silences in the old house. There, silence meant being ignored. Here, it simply meant quiet. The second day passed gently. I arranged my belongings, bought an electric kettle, a desk lamp. Small things, but mine. No permission needed. On the third day, Sophie came by. She stood in the middle of the apartment, looked around once, said nothing, only nodded lightly. "It's okay here," she said slowly, as if convincing herself more than speaking to me. That evening, Sophie called again. I answered, thinking she just wanted to check in. On the other end, I heard footsteps and the quick closing of a door. Then, before Sophie could say anything, another voice came through, not directed at the phone, but clear enough for me to hear. It was Lena's voice, low, firm, speaking to someone beside her, as if the person on the line did not exist. "He's just putting on airs," she said. "He'll stay out a few days to prove a point, then he'll have to come back. Where else could he manage?" There was a brief silence. Sophie went quiet. I said nothing. In that moment, I understood that the most humiliating thing was not being pushed out, but being so certain that you are incapable of living unless you are allowed to. The sentence passed quickly, like a confident assessment. No worry, no doubt. Just the conclusion of someone who believed everything would return to the old order. I sat still, the phone face down on the table. Not angry, not sad, just clear on one thing. In Lena's mind, I had never been someone capable of walking to the end of my own road. I did not go back that week, and I knew I would not go back in the way they were expecting. My silence was not surrender. It was the necessary step back to prepare for what came next, the part where this time I would be the one deciding the timing and the terms. And from that $1,450 apartment, something had begun to shift, slowly but surely. I did not go back after 1 week. I did not call to explain either. When people are used to treating your existence as a habit that will naturally return, the only way to break it is to turn it into something already finished. On the 10th day after I left, I met with Daniel Cross. He is a real estate and trust attorney, the same man who handled my paperwork 20 years ago. We met in his small office on the 3rd floor of an old building. No large sign, no loud marketing. Daniel still reads documents slowly, underlines with a pencil, and never speaks an unnecessary sentence. I stated my objective clearly. Sell the house, fast, clean, without revealing that I was behind it until the very end. Daniel did not ask why. He only asked what I wanted to protect. "Control," I said. He nodded. "Then we do this by the book and let the law speak for the rest." We agreed on the approach. The house would be sold through an existing limited liability company owned by a legitimate trust. I would not appear as an individual in the transaction. Everything would be clean, transparent, and fully compliant. That meant that when the documents became public, there would be no room for emotional arguments. He reminded me that any entry for photos or showings had to be properly noticed under statutory timelines. I followed every step exactly so that when the truth surfaced, no one could claim I had played dirty. I listened carefully. I did not want to win by tricks. I wanted to end it with the truth. We chose a cash sale. The buyer did not require deep technical inspections, did not drag out negotiations. The only condition was that the house match its description. That suited me. I had maintained the property better than they realized. Marketing began with a virtual tour. Photos were taken on days when Lena was traveling for work. 2 in-person showings were scheduled neatly, each lasting less than 30 minutes. I did not appear. The agent worked professionally, arrived and left on time, locked up carefully, leaving no trace. The HOA was notified properly. No objections. All fees had been paid in advance. Records clean. No outstanding issues. To the HOA, this was just another routine transaction. To me, it was the first step toward breathing again. Neighbors began to notice. The agent's car parked in front of the house a few times. Some people stood outside longer than usual. Rumors do not need explanations. Given enough repetition, people connect the dots themselves. Lena did not call me, neither did Evan. To them, I was still just out for a few days. No one considered another possibility because that possibility had never been allowed to exist in their minds. In the 3rd week, Daniel called. "We have a serious buyer. Strong offer. Cash. Wants to close quickly." I asked only one question. "Did they ask about the occupants?" "Yes," Daniel replied. I explained the legal status. The occupants are tenants and will be notified according to the required timeline after closing. I agreed. 3 days later, a sign went up in the front yard. Not large, not flashy. Just one line readable from a distance. Sold, pending close. I looked at the photo Daniel sent to my phone. My heart did not race. There was no rush of satisfaction. Just confirmation that the wheel had left its stationary point. That afternoon, neighbors lingered longer. Some took photos. Some texted each other. Questions began to surface, though no one dared ask directly yet. For Lena and Evan, everything remained quiet. But this silence was different from before. It was no longer a void I endured, but a pause before they realized what had happened. I knew that once they saw that sign with their own eyes, the story would no longer be within their control. No more threats. No more, "you'll come back." No more assumption that I had nowhere else to go. The wheel was already turning, and this time, it was turning in the direction I chose. The call came on a lightly sunny afternoon. I was standing on the balcony of my new apartment, hanging another small potted plant, when my phone vibrated. Lena's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring for a few beats before answering. Her voice was lowered from the very start, unlike before. "How have you been lately, Dad?" The question sounded gentle, but I knew it was not meant to check on me. I replied briefly, polite enough. Lena spoke around the point for a bit, mentioning that Sophie missed me, bringing up small household matters as if I were still living there. Then she moved to what she actually wanted to say. "Dad, we've thought it over. The money issue, it can be adjusted." I didn't interrupt. I waited. "It doesn't need to go up as much as before," Lena continued. "Just an extra 300 to keep things reasonable." 300. The number was released carefully, like a calculated concession. I asked what had made them change their minds so quickly. Lena gave a light laugh over the phone. "We're family, Dad. We don't want to make things tense." I heard very clearly what went unsaid. Family was just another name for recalculating cash flow. "I've already signed a new lease," I said. "It's stable. No need to change anything." There was a brief silence on the other end. Lena didn't interrupt, but I knew she was adjusting her approach. "Living out there must be expensive," she said. "Home is still more convenient. And Sophie can come by more easily." "You can let her come over," I replied. "I won't stop her." Lena didn't bring up money again. She said goodbye, her voice still soft. But the natural rhythm from the beginning was gone. When the call ended, I knew that offer had only been a test, and it had failed. That same afternoon, Evan sent a short message. "Can you give me the landlord's phone number? I want to discuss a few things." I read it and left it there. I didn't reply. Evan didn't wait long. He found another way. I knew because that evening Daniel sent me a forwarded email from the HOA. The content was brief, formal, a notice that the house was in the process of a change in ownership, requesting that relevant parties prepare updated records after completion. The email was sent to the former management address and CC'd to current occupant. Evan had contacted the homeowner, and the homeowner hadn't needed to respond. I looked at the timestamp, before dinner, early enough to be read, late enough that there was no room to maneuver that day. I didn't call Lena. I didn't message Evan. My task now was not to explain, but to let them assemble the pieces themselves. That evening, Sophie texted to ask if I was busy. I replied that I was free. She said her parents were talking about paperwork, sounding tense. I only told her to make sure she ate properly. I understood then. The pretend reconciliation was over. When money is no longer certain, the gentle tone disappears very quickly. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't left to come back for a smaller increase. I had left because I had chosen a different order, one where polite words did not come with an invoice. And from the moment that email appeared, the question was no longer whether I would return, but how they would face this change when there was no one left to negotiate with. The second blow did not come from a confrontation. It came from the system. At 7:12 in the morning, Lena's phone kept vibrating on the kitchen table. She glanced at the screen, frowned, then opened her email. The subject line was unmistakable, sent to all residents in the community. Notice of ownership change, Lot 72. The message was brief, in the usual tone of the homeowners association. The property had completed its transfer. The new owner would assume all rights and obligations as of the stated date. Any questions regarding occupancy were to be directed to the legal department. My name did not appear anywhere in the email. It did not need to. Lena read to the last line, her hands beginning to shake. Evan stood behind her and reached for his own phone. His was vibrating too. The same email, the same recipient list. Colleagues, neighbors, the management office, people who had attended parties, come over for drinks, listened to him talk about my family's house. A knock sounded at the door, not urgent, steady, like a habit. The neighbor across the street stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand. "Lena," she said, her curiosity undisguised, "I saw the community notice. When did you sell the house?" Lena opened her mouth, then closed it. Evan stepped forward. "There must be some mistake." The woman tilted her head. "How could it be a mistake? It clearly says Lot 72. That's your house." Someone else pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window. "Hey, Evan, who's the new owner? Heard it was a cash deal?" The question flew over the fence like a stone. No raised voice, no malice, just perfect timing. Evan turned away, pretending to answer a call, but before he could lift the phone, it rang for real. The caller ID was unmistakable. Human Resources. He answered, forcing his voice steady. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When he hung up, his face had completely changed. An internal email had already circulated. Someone had forwarded the HOA notice, adding a casual remark. "Looks like Evan's father-in-law's house isn't actually in the family's name." In a single morning, a private matter became public conversation. Evan called before noon, his voice shouting through the speaker. "What kind of stunt is this? Selling the house without saying a word?" Lena grabbed the phone. "Shut up." Evan did not. "That old man tricked us for 20 years. Now he's sold it. Where's the money?" Lena tightened her grip. "Are you calling to yell or to ask for help?" There was exactly 1 beat of silence on the other end. Then Evan's voice dropped, familiar in its nakedness. "You know how it is. Ask him. See if he can help a little. I'm stuck." Lena let out a dry laugh, automatic, joyless. "You've called the wrong person." She hung up. Her hand rested on the table. Her eyes stared straight ahead at the empty space where everything used to feel solid. That afternoon, a member of the Homeowners Association stopped by to confirm the occupancy status. The person was polite, handed over paperwork, pointed to where signatures were needed. No one raised their voice. No one needed to assert dominance. But every word on the page said the same thing. This house did not belong to them. Neighbors walked past more slowly than usual. Their gazes lingered longer. No more questions. None were needed. Lena stepped out onto the porch for a moment, then went back inside and closed the door. In the brightly lit kitchen, she sat down on a chair, back straight, arms hanging loose. Evan stood across from her, silent in a way he never was before. No more explanations. No more numbers. No more reasonable arguments. The title of "The One Who Lets Someone Stay" had changed hands. I did not call. I did not take any more calls either. When Daniel Cross texted to say everything was proceeding on schedule, I replied with a single word: "Good." That evening, as the neighborhood lights came on, I sat in my rented apartment, listening to a small radio. The news rolled by: real estate, prices. I brewed tea and drank it slowly. Somewhere else, Lena was standing inside the house she once believed was hers, looking at familiar walls with different eyes. No authority left, only a deadline. I did not need to explain anything further to anyone. The truth had spread on its own. When dignity is built on assumptions, a single email is enough to bring it down in front of an entire neighborhood. And I understood then that the deepest humiliation is not spoken. It is the feeling of being seen by society in your true position after years of standing in the wrong place. After the notice went up in front of the gate, the house slipped into an entirely different state. There were no more long conversations about expenses, no more talk of adjusting things reasonably. In their place came urgency. Cardboard boxes appeared, cabinets were pulled open. Things that had once been taken for granted now became burdens that had to be calculated. Lena and Evan started going to view houses. There were no luxuries in choice anymore. Places once dismissed as too cramped, low ceiling, or too far from downtown now became options they had to consider. Each time they returned, they sat across from each other in the kitchen, laptops open, comparing prices, subtracting and recalculating. Their voices gradually rose. Neither was willing to give way. Evan talked about the market. Lena talked about timing. Evan blamed not having checked the legal situation more carefully. Lena shot back that if Evan had not stayed silent all those years, things would have turned out differently. The conversation always ended in the same place, the money they had missed out on. Not the house, the opportunity. The opportunity to have their names on an asset they had assumed was theirs by default. Evan called me one evening after trying to call Lena several times. His voice was no longer sharp, nor did he circle around the point. "Dad, I'm really stuck. I need to cover a short-term gap." I asked a very simple question. "What do you plan to use to pay it back?" Evan was silent for quite a while. On the other end there was only heavy breathing, steady but hollow, like someone checking their pockets, while knowing for sure there was nothing there. "I don't have a plan yet," he said quietly, avoiding the question. "I just need to get through this phase. Once things stabilize, I'll pay you back," I answered plainly. "I'm not lending you money." He began talking about family, about bonds, about the years gone by. I listened, then said slowly, "I did lend before, many times. Every time was the last time. This time it stops." The call ended quickly. No argument, no harsh words. Just a door closing at the right moment. Sophie was different. She came by more often. She brought no questions. She never mentioned money. She helped me hang up a few photos, asked about my medication, told me stories about school. Once, she said softly, "I don't know which side I'm supposed to be on." I put my hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to be on anyone's side. You just need to live correctly." Sophie nodded. Her eyes looked lighter. Lena's moving day arrived sooner than they expected. A smaller house, fewer rooms, a tight parking space. New neighbors they did not know. No one there knew the story behind it. Just a family moving in, trying to keep up appearances of normalcy. That night, I received a message from Evan. One short line. "Everything's done." I read it and did not reply. Not out of satisfaction, simply because there was nothing left to say. Aftershocks always come after the blast. They are not loud. They linger. They reveal cracks that were already there. When interests disappear, what remains finally shows itself. I sat in my apartment, listening to the radio, brewing tea. Outside, the city kept moving at its old pace. I did not defeat anyone. I simply took back the part of my life I had lent out for far too long, and for the first time in many years, the silence around me was no longer heavy. It was quiet enough to breathe, clear enough to know exactly where I was standing. I bought my new house on a lightly sunny morning, a single-story place, small yard, flat walkway, good natural light. The price was $640,000. I paid in full and finished signing everything within a single morning. The agent asked whether I wanted to take out a loan to keep cash flow flexible. I shook my head. At my age, I need clarity more than flexibility. On moving day, I hung the curtains myself, rearranged the bookshelves, placed my old radio on a low shelf. Everything was within easy reach. No bending, no stretching. That feeling made me realize I had lived far too long in spaces decided by other people. The following week, I saw a geriatric doctor at my scheduled appointment. She reviewed my file, asked about my daily routine, had me go through a few basic tests. The conclusion was simple. Heart fine, joints need regular movement, memory sharp. You take good care of yourself, she said. There's no reason for you to depend on anyone right now. I smiled. Hearing that felt lighter than a prescription. I spent the afternoon opening an education fund account for Sophie. The terms were straightforward. The money could only be used for education and personal startup purposes, released according to clear milestones. I signed the documents, folded them, and placed them in a stiff folder. No grand announcements. I wanted what was right to stand on its own. Sophie stopped by over the weekend. She walked along the porch, looking at the new plants I'd put in. "This house suits you," she said. I nodded. "I think so too." We cooked a simple dinner and ate slowly. She talked about school, friends, no questions about money, no probing. I listened and realized what I was choosing to keep. Lena came by one late afternoon, announcing herself with a short text beforehand. When she stepped into the yard, her eyes lingered on the new house longer than necessary. She looked at the living room, the kitchen, the armchair. She didn't ask the price, didn't praise or criticize. She just let out a breath, like someone who had finally understood something too late. "Are you doing okay here, Dad?" she asked. "I am," I replied. "I can take care of myself." Lena sat down, hands on her thighs, back straight. She talked about the new, smaller house, about the expenses they had to cut. Her words were steady, but the sense of loss underneath was unmistakable. "I didn't think things would go this far," she said. I looked at her slowly. "Things went this far the moment you started calculating me in numbers." She fell silent, eyes lowered. "Could you help a little?" I shook my head. "I've already finished helping my part." The silence stretched. I stood up to pour water. When I came back, I said the sentence I had weighed for a long time. "You didn't lose the house today. You lost your father years ago when you decided to treat him as an expense." Lena looked up. She didn't cry. She simply stiffened. "That's too harsh," she said. "Not harsh. Just said at the right time." She stood up and walked toward the porch. Before leaving, she paused and looked around once more. This time there was no measuring gaze, only the realization that some things, once missed, cannot be bought back. That evening I sat alone, turned on the radio, brewed tea. Sophie texted, "Go to bed early, Grandpa." I replied with a small symbol. Enough said. People often ask why a father would choose this path. In truth, I didn't choose to abandon anyone. I chose to keep relationships that can stand upright, without leaning on benefits. At this age, that choice lets me sleep in peace. And in that single-story house, I know exactly who I will let stay with me. Not because of blood, but because of how people behave when there is nothing left to take. The days that followed passed slowly and evenly. I grew accustomed to the new rhythm of life in the single-story house. I woke early, opened the door to let the sunlight in, brewed coffee, read the printed newspaper. At noon, I walked around the neighborhood, greeted a few new neighbors. In the afternoon, I watered the plants and fixed small things around the house. No one checked whether I was still breathing. No one mentioned money. No one calculated things for me to keep them reasonable. That sense of calm felt strange at first. After years of living under constant scrutiny over every small thing, the ability to decide for myself became more valuable than any convenience. I no longer needed to prove that I was fine. I simply lived at my own pace. Lena called a few times. At first, the calls were long. Then they shortened into brief messages. "Are you okay, Dad? Do you have time to talk?" I looked at the screen and then put the phone down. Not out of anger, not as punishment. I simply no longer wanted to play the role of someone who must always respond the moment he is called. Some relationships exist because of habit, not because of respect. When the habit ends, the emptiness becomes very clear. One evening, sitting out on the porch in the cool air, I thought about Margaret, about her final years in the hospital, about her grip growing weaker, about the sentence she left behind like an instruction. Keep the secret to keep the right to decide. At the time, I believed I had done the right thing. Now I understand that a secret only has value if the one who keeps it is willing to pay the price. My price was many years of silence, many moments of lowering my head, many mornings awakened by a knock just to confirm that I still existed. Margaret endured more than I did. She saw it earlier, and she accepted the pain so that I would not have to carry the heaviest part alone. Thinking of that, I feel no regret that the truth was finally exposed. I only regret that it came so late. Sophie stopped by on the weekend. She brought pastries and talked about her study plans. I listened and nodded. When she left, I stood at the door and watched her go. I knew I had chosen the right place to put the rest of my life. Night fell. The house grew quiet. I turned on the small radio, old music playing softly. The phone lay on the table, screen dark. I was no longer waiting for another call. Some things, once faced directly, cannot be unseen. I did not win by taking their house away. I won because I took my life back. And this time, I will keep it until the end. Some stories do not end with applause, but with a quiet mourning, when a person is finally able to live the part of life that truly belongs to them. I am not telling this to prove who was right or wrong, but to say that there are boundaries which, if you do not reset them yourself, will be erased very gently, very reasonably, very for the sake of family. If you have ever been treated like a burden while being called an obligation, if your right to decide was taken away by words that sounded kind, leave a dot in the comments and tell me where you are listening from, so I know that silence like this was not born by me alone. And if you want to hear more stories where justice does not need to shout, but still stands firm, follow the channel, because sometimes the bravest thing is not defeating others, but daring to take your life back.